My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, Guru Piran Neo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm continuing Mahan's philosophy, the I God philosophy, and today we cover the concept of darkness, Erul, part 2, the higher order substratum. What I'd like to cover today is the concept of darkness, which we covered the last time in part 1. Here we mapped out what Erul is. Erul is this formless, omnipresent state, and this Erul state cannot be created. And we see that the Erul state is beyond our four-dimensional universe, which is the three-dimensional space and time, and what we call a higher order continuum, and perhaps an uncountable dimensions. Let's call it infinite, an infinite substratum. And sometimes this is referred to as the God continuum. It's infinite, which is beyond our four-dimensional universe. And in this lecture, I'll talk about how this infinite substratum or the zero state or higher order substratum Mahan defines, which is the formless and omnipresent state, with some examples of this higher order state that supports our four-dimensional universe. So let's do some thought experiment on this higher order dimensions. So let's start with the basic dimension. So assume that we have a zero-dimensional person. That means somebody who's like a dot person. So and what that means is that this person's dimensional characteristic is that they are there in one place, and that they can't cognize what's on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, nor on above or below, in front or back. They just exist as a dot. And this is what we call a zero-dimensional person. This person cannot cognize anything around them, above them, below them. And oftentimes it exists as a dot. But if this dot had someone like a Mahan-like quality, they will say that I exist as this dot, but something must be supporting or holding me in this space. And that space that I cannot cognize must be of a higher order to keep me intact or hold me together. And that state that is holding me together is beyond my dot dimensional personality, but yet I know it exists. And that must be a higher order, and that is treated as Erul. So this enlightened zero-dimensional person would say that there must be a state beyond my dimensionality that supports me, and this must be a higher order state. And my whole existence is to understand my zero-dimensionality, but also in the context of this higher order state. So this is where we see that that understanding of the current state of existence and the state that is beyond that supports this. Let's take this example to the next step. Suppose we have a one-dimensional person. This is a line. Again, this ordinary one-dimensional person would be able to cognize the world right up to the end of that white space on the right-hand side and the left side. And anything beyond that, they are unable to cognize. Similarly, they can't cognize what's above nor below, because that's the characteristics of this one-dimensional personality, right? And they can't cognize what's above and below. So what we see is that for a one-dimensional person, that is, ordinary person, will exist in this dimension. But suppose we had a one-dimensional person which had a Mahan-like personality. They will say, well, this is my dimensional characteristics in this one dimension, but there must be something that supports this one dimension. So while the mind is in one dimensional, the material mind, which is in one dimensional, it starts to expand to try to explore what is holding me. There must be something which is of a higher order that is holding me. And the search is to discover this. And this whole idea of the inability to cognize this higher order is this substratum that Mahan calls Erul, or darkness, the higher order substratum that holds on, that gives existence to this one-dimensional identity. Let's proceed on. Suppose we have a two-dimensional person. Now you have length and breadth. You still have volume is 0, but we have, length and breadth. So this two-dimensional person would be able to exist in this white space here. Again, they'll be able to exist up to that point of where the white space, and that when that ends, they are unable to cognize what that is. They can exist up to the white space above and below them. Anything beyond that realm, they would not be able to cognize. What's really interesting is that for this two-dimensional person, what's in front or what's behind is uncognizable, because they are on a two-dimensional, in their two dimensions. And you see that this two dimensions limits them from, the three dimension does not exist. So they exist in this two-dimensional plane, and anything beyond that realm is treated as the Erul, or the higher order dimension that gives existence to this two-dimensional space. An ordinary person in this may just exist in this two-dimensional space, but someone who's of a Mahan-like mindset will start exploring. Yes, though I am limited to this two-dimensionality, there must be something beyond me that is of a higher order that holds me in this state of existence. The same thing in terms of pushing this analysis a little bit more. If we had a two-dimensional plane and now we have two persons, say A and B, the question then is that what would they, if they looked at each other, what would they see? And this is quite interesting. What do you think they will see? This brings us to this notion of what seeing means. Seeing means that, at least in the context of, human beings, we know that light travels, and it hits another object and reflects back, and our retina picks this. But here in this two-dimensional universe, I have not introduced time. So time does not exist. So without time, we don't have, light traveling. And if there's no light traveling, what would they actually see? They would see nothing, because time is not here. Time is not present in this universe. So again, while they exist, because time is not there, they will not see anything. But what's really interesting is that we are of a higher dimension. We are able to see, and we have time, and we are four-dimensional species. We are now observing this two-dimensional space with two personalities, A and B. We see both of them. They may not be able to see because time is not present in that universe, but we can see of a higher order. So what we see here is that the two-dimensional person is limited up to the dimensionality, and oftentimes they exist, and but the ones that are really curious will ask this question: what's supporting me? What's supporting me in this plane? So again, as we see that we are of a higher order dimension, we are able to see personality A and personality B. In that same way, if you go back, here too, we see that, the two-dimensional person will not be able to cognize what's above and below, but we are able to see everything because we are of a higher order dimension. In the same way, we see that personality A may not be able to see personality B, but we can see both of them. Suppose now, for some reason, time is in this two-dimensional space. So I'm introducing this for this plane, or this example. Assume we have time and seeing is possible. So we have seeing is possible for these two. What would they see? So they're only able to see what's on that plane, but they would not be able to see the third dimension. So if seeing is possible for A and B, what would they see? And we see that they would be able to see only a thin line, and that's what they will be able to observe, because they would not be able to see the third dimension, because third dimension does not exist. Right? In that same way, we see that a three-dimensional person, again, we see that they would be able to see length, breadth, and width. But what does, if I do not introduce time here, what would they see? They would not see anything. And if I now introduce time, what that means is that we're now moving towards a three-dimensional entity or being that is traveling in time. And this brings us to the four-dimensional person, which is who we are. The three-dimensional body that goes through changes over time, and time is the fourth dimension. And we see that in our own lives, we start off as a fetus, a baby, and then slowly we start crawling to a boy or a girl, and we attain youth. We then become mature person, and then the aging process comes in, and eventually we attain, samadhi or the merging process. So in all this, we see that the three-dimensional body undergoes change over time, and we all experience that. I can remember, from the age of 2 to 3, being a young boy going to school and playing games and going to university and, getting married and the full works, right? So we all experience this changes of our body over time. But what is really interesting here is that when time is in very small intervals, short period of time, we can't see the difference. For example, every day you observe yourself, you would not be able to see the difference. But if you observe yourself over a longer period of time, say, for example, you go back and look at your albums and how you were then and how you were now, you'd be able to see the big difference. But every day or every second, you'd not be able to see the changes. So what we see here is that in small intervals, we do not see the differences or the changes in our body. But over a long period of time, we see those changes that are taking place. But what is interesting is that the problem that we have in this dimension is that we can only be in one place at a particular time. That means the time is, at a particular time only we experience and we move on. And interestingly, that we cannot go back to that experience. We remember those experiences, but we cannot transition back to those experiences. That is because in our universe, time is linear. Time is only in one direction. So that is why we see that while we remember being a youth or remember, being a child, but we can't go back because time has moved on. Time is moving in a linear direction. So if I put this in this context, in a much more kind of a simpler chart, assume that this person is three-dimensional and they're moving across time. And we start off as a primordial seed. We have birth and babyhood and right up to the samadhi stage. So we have this continuum. So the person in that three-dimensional plus time, the four-dimensional person, would experience this. The experience would be very real, but we would not be able to go back in time, and we are moving forward continuously. But assume now that this observer is one level higher, one dimension higher. So it's not in the fourth dimension, it's on the fifth dimension where the person can observe time too. You see, for us, we observe time in that present moment, but we can't experience the past, nor have we experienced the future. We only experience a moment in time, and that trots on. And that's what we mean by life. But assume now that we are now transitioning to a higher dimension, the fifth dimension, where we can also observe time simultaneously. So as how we see in the screen, we are seeing the entire evolution of life from, birth right up to death. And we can observe time without being caught up in time, because the fifth dimension enables you to separate yourself from that fourth dimension. What's really interesting is that I'm telling you the story about the three dimension, four dimension on a flat screen, which is two dimension, right? So assume that, we are able to, on the fifth dimension, we're able to observe time and observe the evolution. Then what is really interesting is that what the four-dimensional being is unable to do, the fifth dimension person is able to see the entire continuum. So in the as a fourth dimensional being, we are unable to go back in time because, we experience time at a particular moment in time. But if we move to a higher order dimension, we see the entire continuum, every stage of our evolution. And can you imagine if we had that fifth dimension, we are able to go back in time, right? We're able to go back in time, go forward, so time is no more linear. So time becomes non-linear. And can you imagine what this personality would be? This personality would be transcendental to that four-dimensional material universe, transcendental to time. If you made mistakes, you know, uh, yesterday, you can go back and correct it, you see. So to some extent, moving to the fifth dimension already makes us supernatural in the sense of being transcendental to this material universe. So the mere fact that as we move from the one-dimensional to the two-dimensional, the two-dimensional being has added advantage to the one dimension. And to some extent, it is supporting that one dimension. And as we move up to a higher dimensional order, we see that the continuum, essentially, you're able to see through, like how we are able to see through the entire four-dimensional universe. As we go higher and higher, we see that existence completely transforms and changes. And this is what Swamiji speaks about in terms of this Erul, is of a higher order dimension. Now, having said this, we see that whether it's the one dimension, two dimension, three dimension, the four dimension, in all this dimensionality, we see that while the dimensions may be limited, within the dimension we have something which is dimensionless, you see, which is of a higher order dimension. I'll speak about this in the next lecture on how do we experience as a being the dimensions and the dimensionless. But here we show in this example that uh, that is, if we move to this higher dimension, you become transcendental to this material universe. Hence, we see that the higher order dimension is essentially, from a logical perspective, what Mahan is describing, this Erul darkness, is the state that is uncognizable by this sentient or biological being. This four-dimensional being realizes that there is something far greater than this biology that I can't cognize, which is of a higher order that supports this existence. And this higher order or Erul is not cognizable using the four-dimensional biology. So to experience this, one needs to transcend this four-dimensional biology. And this is where we see that the process of meditation and various practices that enable one to attain this, understand that while the biology or the material body is imprinted with this limitedness, within this material body, this existence of this Erul, which is of a higher order, is also imprinted. So here Mahan speaks about how this Erul, which is of a higher order, is imprinted in our DNA. And he gives examples where the pleasure of the eyes disappears when the eyes are shut. What he's saying is that as long as our material senses are open, we are attuned to all the experiences of this material world. The moment those material senses are silenced, we experience this formless transcendental state, which is omnipresent in us. The same thing he says, that the pleasure of the mouth disappears in the throat. Once the sensory perception, once the food and the thing passes that sensory perception, it goes quiet, everything is silent. In the same way, he says about the ears and the pleasure of touch. As long as the sensory perceptions are wide awake and our experiences are of this material nature, we see that we will experience that material world very profoundly. That'll be real. But as this slowly quietens down and the sense of quietude that takes place in the mind, where the sight, the sound, the taste all goes to sleep, this substratum emerges. And this is exactly what Swamiji shows, that in this picture where we have this Erul, which powers this material biology that exists in this material universe, experiences this material universe, though it is anchored on that Erul state. And he shows that the absence of the material senses, the four-dimensional material body, will lead to the Erul state. As how we saw earlier, while our senses are wide awake, we experience this material world. This, as I depict that with the white space there. And when all of that goes quiet, when there's a quietude in the mind, the profoundness of this Erul or this higher order state of existence starts emerging and magnifying, and a sense of being one with this universal higher order state that Swamiji speaks about. So to summarize, we see that within all of us we have this, we are imprinted with this four-dimensional universe, which is our biology, which is three-dimensional in time, and time is linear. We experience that. But while we experience this changes that continuously happens, deep down within us, there is a substratum which is unchanging and formless, dimensionless, of a infinite order that it's, what Swamiji calls a higher order state of existence. And he defines that as the big I, and the four-dimensional material universe as the small I. As we go on to the lectures in the coming weeks, we'll speak about both this limitedness, or what we call the transitory God, and the transcendental God that is imprinted in all of us. The transitory God, the form of God. We are all, God in different forms in this material universe that continuously changes, and we experience that change. Even the biology and the dimensionality that is imprinted in us, but within us, we also have the changeless substratum that is core to our DNA. So this is what Swamiji speaks about in terms of the darkness or Erul. In the next lecture, I'll speak about how does one cognize both this transitory and the transcendental gods that Swamiji speaks about, or this personality. Sandosham to everybody.